Greetings, sisters and brothers, friends, comrades. Welcome to African History Club. This is episode number 35. I'm your host, Milton Alimadi. I welcome any new patrons. So today I'm going to focus on my new book, Manufacturing Hate, How Africa Was Demonized in Western Media, as I indicated in the last podcast. Here's how the book looks. It looks exactly like the flyer that I posted on the Patreon page. So how will I approach it today? Well, let me first discuss a couple of issues of note. Some people have indicated to me that they had difficulty ordering a copy on Amazon, that they got the message that it's out of stock, and obviously I'm contacting the publisher, Kendall Hunt, to make sure that the book is stocked with Amazon, but also want to give the number of the sales contact at the publishing company. And I encourage, in fact, I urge people to call her to make sure that the book is stocked, and indicate to her that you were not able to get a copy, if indeed you were not. Her name is Sue Saad, S-A-A-D, Saad. And her number is 732-985-2244. And her email address is ssaad@kendallhunt.com. That's KENDALLHUNT.com. And obviously, you should try Amazon again, just in case it is back in stock. So today I will cover maybe 2 chapters in addition to the preface to the book and the introduction. So that would give us about 4 chapters or so. The total chapters are 17 chapters. So over the next couple of weeks, we'll be able to cover the entire book. I will try to do it with each subsequent podcast. But if there are major topical issues ongoing on the continent, then I will interrupt and focus on that particular issue before resuming the discussion of the book in subsequent podcasts. And also, please, if you have any questions, please do post the questions after each episode. And when I start off the next podcast, the subsequent podcast, I will address those questions so that we have sort of a conversation that is ongoing. At some point, for any of you that are in New York, I will be doing some readings and book signings, and I will let you know when that would be. And I will also, of course, let you know the location. So I am negotiating with a couple of locations here in New York City. And even though I know many people have now been vaccinated, we would still, of course, exercise precaution and make sure that there's adequate spacing and social distancing so that everybody feels comfortable and safe when we do any of the in-person readings. Additionally, I will also do some additional online readings that are separate from the series of discussions that I'll be doing on this podcast. So let me start with the story behind the story. The main reason why I ended up writing this book was because even as a young boy, I was always frustrated by the way Africa was depicted in US media, in European media, particularly British. So I'm Uganda born, but my family also lived in Tanzania when Idi Amin was in power in Uganda. Idi Amin, who was of course installed by the British and by Israel because they were very dissatisfied by the then president of the time, Milton Obote, who had decisively shifted Uganda's politics toward the left, and he had become closely aligned with Julius Nyerere, the late Julius Nyerere, president of Tanzania, who, of course, as many of you know, is one of my heroes. So my family lived in Tanzania, and when I was in Tanzania, I think I was around 12 years old, when my father started sending me out to buy him the early edition of the newspaper, the Daily News in Tanzania. I would go out at midnight, actually about 11 p.m., and I would read the entire paper and then deliver it to him at home at midnight. And that's how I started becoming familiar with the world. I became familiar with the apartheid regime in South Africa, supported by the West, of course. I became familiar with the Vietnam War and the American massive bombing campaigns in Vietnam. And then I also read in particular how Tanzania presented the narrative as opposed to how American and British publications presented the same narrative of South Africa, of the Vietnam War. Because I also started going to the United States Information Services. I think that's what it was called, USIS. And they had all sorts of American publications there. So I started reading the New York Times, the Washington Post, Time Magazine, Newsweek, in addition to British publications as well. And as I said, I was really enraged by the way Africa was presented as a 12-year-old. But obviously you cannot do much about it as a 12-year-old. But that is also when I started writing letters to editor in Tanzania. And eventually when I came to the United States to go to college, I continued doing that. Whenever I wanted to challenge the way an African story was covered, or Africans were depicted, or Haitians were depicted, or African descendants here in the United States, African Americans. And I found myself doing that all the time, even though my first degree and my second degree as well, my master's, was in economics, not really journalism at the time. But then many of my friends convinced me that, listen, rather than just shouting from outside the walls, why don't you become an active journalist and participate in changing the narrative? So I took that advice and I went back to school. I went to the Graduate School of Journalism at Columbia, and I took the master's degree in journalism. Now, for the journalism master's, you get to write a thesis. And I wrote mine on the evolution of Western writings about Africa in media, Western media. So I did the research and read the so-called journals, that's what they call them, the books written by these arrogant so-called explorers who went to Africa. They essentially were the scouts, the agents of imperialism, which was to follow later They started going around the 17th century to map the continent out, locate where the resources were. They renamed all these great lakes, rivers, and mountains and gave them European names, even though they had African names. Nam Lolwe, Lolwe, in East Africa, for example, became Lake Victoria, and it's still called Lake Victoria today in the 21st century. But that's another story. In fact, I'll devote a podcast to discussing those issues of these names in the future. And then, after this critiquing the works of the so-called explorers, I then started examining the writings by writers who were sent to the continent by publications such as the New York Times, National Geographic, and later on Time Magazine, Newsweek, and publications such as the New Yorker magazine. And the ones that went to Africa, the Times, I think, sent a writer as early as 1926, before they started going in more numbers in the 1950s, particularly the late 1950s. Africa was heading toward decolonization. And the writing style basically was to take the template that had been created by the so-called explorers who had demonized Africa in order to justify the crimes that had already been committed, enslavement, and the crimes that were about to be imposed, which was colonial conquest. So they took that same approach. Here is a continent with a people that are backward and uncivilized. So this is the general broad overview of what I found. I was fortunate to breathe some life into my project by being able to go to the archives of the New York Times and to actually get copies of letters exchanged by reporters sent by the Times to cover Africa, particularly the decolonization from 1959 onwards. And I had suspected that I might find offensive material, but some of the letters, the racism would surprise you. And of course, I will read some excerpts of those letters in the book, Manufacturing Hate. So now, let me tell you some of the challenges I faced even publishing this work as a paper. When I was at the journalism school, the paper I wrote, my master's paper, I think I called it Darkest Times in Africa. It was nominated for one of those prizes that they give at the end of the semester. They give out about 4 or 5 journalism awards. So the paper won one of those prizes. And a magazine, which at one point I had respect for because I was still a little naive at that time, called Columbia Journalism Review, invited me to submit the paper for publication. And I did, and I eagerly awaited because it was respected publication, and it still is to some extent. It does not deserve the respect at all, and I'll tell you why. Because their function is supposedly to be the arbiters or to maintain standards in journalism. And it is important to have a publication like that. So one issue came out without my paper being published. A second issue came out. I think maybe even a third issue. And now I'm about to graduate. And obviously I wanted the paper to be published while I'm still there. so that myself and my peers, we can see it in Columbia Journalism Review. So then I called the editor, his name was Michael Hoyt, and I asked what was going on with my paper. And he told me that a decision had been made not to publish it. And of course I said, and when were you going to tell me this? And he could not respond to that question. And I said, what happened? What was the problem? He said, well, 2 editors voted to publish it and 2 opposed publishing. And the decisive vote was cast by the executive editor, who was above him, not to publish. And I said, what was the issue? And he said, there was a belief or a thought that these things happened a long time ago, which is preposterous. And I said, so how do you write history without going back a long time ago? And of course, he could not respond to that question. So then I said, I want my paper back. And he said something which was very, very curious. He said, why do you want it back? It sounded completely absurd. And I said, it's my paper. That's why I want it back. And then he said something amazing. He said, it's not the same as what you gave us. It's been extensively edited. I said, well, in that case, that is precisely why I want it back. So then, of course, I went to the Columbia Journalism Review office, which is actually located in the same building as the journalism school at Columbia. And, I just came into his office, and, he's standing behind a desk, behind a pile of papers. And he sees me and he's shocked, and he goes around searching for my papers, different locations, opening different locations. And then comes back to the same spot where I had seen him, and he pulls out the paper. And now I'm perplexed. What is wrong with this man? So I take my paper and I start reading it as I'm leaving his office. And then I saw immediately why they had not published the paper. In fact, they were afraid of the New York Times, how the New York Times might react to the publication of my paper. And they inserted something that confirmed this fear that they had into the edited version of my paper without telling me, meaning they had tried their best to massage, to eviscerate the paper, but even after writing what essentially is an apologia to the Times, they decided not to publish it. And let me read from the book. So let me start from this point here. I called Hoyt and demanded to know why my paper had not yet been published. I was surprised when Hoyt, in a rather timid tone, informed me that a decision had been made not to publish my paper. Said the editorial board, consisting of 5 members, quote, after long discussions, end quote, had been deadlocked. 2 editors voted in favor and 2 opposed publication. So let me skip down to when I read what they had written on my behalf. Okay, so let me continue from the book now. When I read the edited version of my paper, which was in galley form, in preparation for publication, I found that the editors had inserted the following paragraph on my behalf, unbeknownst to me and without my consent. Quote, recently, the Times granted me access to its archives, including correspondences from the 1950s, when the paper sent Big Art to Africa on a temporary assignment. Big Art is referring to Homer Big Art, who was sort of a renowned reporter. He had won the Pulitzer Prize 2 times already when he was with the Herald Tribune before he went to the Times. And then the Times sent him to Africa. So that's what they were referring to. So let me continue now from the book. After studying the archival material, I interviewed several present and former Times reporters. The following excerpts from that material and from lengthy interviews are not intended as an indictment of the Times, whose African coverage has occasionally been distinguished, but as a means of highlighting a problem that all news organizations need to address, end quote. So this is not even me saying this. This is the editors at the review writing on my behalf. And even after inserting that, they decided not to publish the paper. So after that, I sent it to a couple of other publications, including the Village Voice, New York Magazine, the New Yorker, Mother Jones. I could not get any of them to publish it. And it wasn't that the paper was not of quality. Obviously, the subject matter was as important then as it is today, when we're now having this whole conversation about history and race issues. So, and the other reason why I knew it was not because of the quality that the paper was not being published, and it was more likely because of whoever published it would be seen as going into a history of the New York Times, that the New York Times, but perhaps some editors of the Times would prefer to remain untold. And I'll give you one example of how I realized that was the case. I got a rejection letter from the New Yorker magazine. I don't remember the precise wording, but something to the effect that was not a good fit and all that kind of, standard rejection letter. But on the typed rejection, there was a handwritten note by the editor of the New Yorker, who suggested that I should send it to Mother Jones. So obviously it was not about the quality. So I went ahead and sent it to Mother Jones, and Mother Jones rejected it as well. And it was at that point that I said, this is material that I need to publish on my own. And I continued the research, and at one point I did self-publish under the title, The Hearts of Darkness, How White Writers Created the Racist Image of Africa. And that was around 2003. So it's quite some time ago. And then in the subsequent years, I've been continuing the research. I've expanded it, I've updated it to include coverage up to the war on Libya, the NATO war on Libya in 2010, 2011. And it was only recently that I finally found a publisher, Kendall Hunt Publishing. And that is how we ended up with this book, which officially was published on June the 14th, 2021. So that is the backstory. The backstory actually has taken a little longer than what I had anticipated, but I think it was important. So we may not be able to cover up to chapter 2 as I had hoped on this first episode of the podcast dealing with the book. But there are some parts that I wanted to read as well. So let me go to the introduction and read a little bit from there. And this is on the war on Libya by NATO. There's a part I want to read, but then there's a part that I should probably just summarize so that we use the remaining time efficiently. My publication, Black Star News, wrote more than 100 editorials, possibly, opposing the NATO war on Libya. More than 100, I'm quite sure. And then at some point, one editorial in particular, after the insurgents supported by the United States and NATO had started targeting Libyans who look like me, have my complexion. So it became like a explicitly racist ethnic cleansing campaign, particularly the Libyans that lived in the city of Targa. And people who are not familiar with that story, you can, research it or Google Targa. I think it's sometimes spelled Tawargha. I've also seen that spelled Tawerga or Gha, Targa, which was inhabited exclusively by Libyans that looked like me. And that city was ethnically cleansed as the rebels marched toward Tripoli. And the buildings were burnt, people were killed, many fled. And on the buildings, they wrote explicit racist language. So there was no question that this was an ethnic cleansing campaign. And this was not covered by the major Western media, except the Wall Street Journal, to their credit. So we wrote editorials about that. And one editorial in particular, I urge readers to call the New York Times and ask why they're not covering this episode, this horrific massacres of Libyans that look like me. And I put out the phone numbers of the editors, I put the phone numbers of the publisher, I put the phone numbers of the State Department, the White House, the NAACP, the Urban League. And then a couple of hours later, we could no longer access our website. We could not access the website for almost 3 days. And every time I called the host, Network Solutions, I was told it was a technical issue they were trying to resolve. And then on the third night, I woke up early, like maybe around 4 a.m. Something just tells you sometimes something is going on. And I called, and this time I took the name. I said, give me your name and your title. Give me your name. I spoke to about 2 or 3 people. I said, because I don't believe that of the thousands of websites that you guys host, that all of them are not able to access their website for 3 days. I don't believe it. I woke up a couple of hours later, logged on, the website was back up. Now I'm curious, what's going on? The editorial that we posted urging people to call the New York Times, State Department, White House, Urban League, NAACP had been deleted from our website, by the powers that be, that did not like. Obviously, this is a problematic story. If this news was widely covered, obviously, people in this country, particularly people in the African American community, would say, why are we supporting a war targeting Africans, going particularly after, quote unquote, black people in Libya? And that is why I give credit to the Wall Street Journal for breaking that conspiracy of silence among the major media, who are actually cheerleaders for the war on Libya. In fact, I remember one editorial in the New York Times admonishing NATO for not bombing sufficiently in order to break Gaddafi's back and end the war and his regime sooner rather than later. Remarkable, from a so-called liberal newspaper. So now let me read from the book. To what extent did corporate media enable the NATO war of aggression that destroyed Libya? Throughout the conflict, The New York Times referred to the anti-Gaddafi insurgents in glowing terms as, quote, revolutionaries, even though the insurgents themselves were posting evidence of their barbaric atrocities, beheadings against Black Libyans on YouTube. Presumably, the Times editorial board hoped that once they seized power, the insurgents would transform themselves overnight into Democrats. The NATO-backed insurgents eventually deposed Gaddafi. They lived up to their reputation of brutality. Gaddafi was captured and sodomized with a bayonet and eventually killed. Many of his captured fighters were summarily executed. A black fighter was infamously tied like a trophy on the mounted gun of a military jeep, which was triumphantly driven around. Gaddafi's body was publicly displayed in an open refrigerated room. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, when told of Gaddafi's death, laughingly told a television interviewer, quote, "We came, we saw, he died," end quote. Clinton then hurriedly flew to Libya and posed for photographs with the insurgents, now the new power. Presumably, she believed the photograph would be valuable in the future once she launched her 2016 presidential run. Perhaps she planned to use the picture to remind voters of her role in creating the new Libya. Clinton's celebration was premature. By 2014, the NATO war on Libya had turned out to have been a colossal disaster. The country was reduced to total anarchy, a non-state, a haven for several terrorist groups, including ISIS. So this is a little sampling from that introduction. I don't think we'll have time to get actually into chapter 1 and chapter 2, but I think this is a good setting to launch us into subsequent chapters of this book, Manufacturing Hate, which, as I said, covers a wide span from the 17th century all the way to our contemporary era. So in the next episode, we'll deal with chapter 1, 2, and hopefully chapter 3. So thank you for your support, and try your best to get a copy of Manufacturing Hate, How Africa Was Demonized in Western Media. And remember to call Sue Saad if you can't get a copy through Amazon. Thank you, sisters and brothers. Stay strong. Remain Pan-African. See you in the next episode.